The pistol shot echoed through the dusty streets of Spokane, Washington, and Eleanor Ashford knew it wasn't meant for her, but the stray bullet found her anyway, tearing through the left side of her face as she stood outside the general store on that sweltering August afternoon in 1878. She had been 20 years old, beautiful by all accounts, with golden hair that caught the sunlight and green eyes that made men stumble over their words. The two drunken cowboys fighting over a card game hadn't even noticed her fall, hadn't seen the blood pooling in the dirt, hadn't heard her screams as the shopkeeper's wife rushed to her side. That was 3 years ago, and Eleanor had survived, but the face she wore now was not the one she had been born with. The scar ran from her left temple down through her cheek, puckering the skin and pulling her eye slightly downward. Her mouth twisted at the corner, making her smile look like a grimace. She had learned to keep her head down, to let her hair fall forward like a curtain, to move through Spokane like a ghost that no one wanted to see. The pity in people's eyes was worse than the horror, worse than the children who pointed and asked their mothers what was wrong with the lady's face. She worked at the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, cleaning rooms and changing linens, keeping to the shadows where she belonged. But Eleanor had not given up on every dream. She wanted to be married, to have a home of her own, to have children who would love her regardless of how she looked. When Thomas Greene came to town in the spring of 1881, a quiet man who worked at the lumber mill, she thought perhaps God had finally answered her prayers. Thomas was not handsome, was not charming, but he was kind. He spoke to her without flinching, sat with her at church without shame, and after 6 months of cautious courtship, he asked her to marry him. Eleanor had wept with joy, had clutched his hands, and said yes a dozen times, had already begun imagining the life they would build together. Thomas was 32, steady and reliable, and he promised her that her scars meant nothing to him. They went to see Reverend Caldwell on a Tuesday morning in October when the air had turned crisp and the leaves were falling from the cottonwoods that lined the Spokane River. Reverend Caldwell was a tall man with silver hair and a voice that could shake the rafters when he preached about hellfire and damnation. He had been the spiritual leader of Spokane's Presbyterian Church for 15 years, and no one questioned his authority. Eleanor sat in his office, her hands folded in her lap, while Thomas explained their intention to marry. The Reverend looked at Eleanor for a long moment, his blue eyes cold and assessing. "Miss Ashford, I need to speak plainly with you." "Yes, sir," Eleanor said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "The holy union of marriage is a sacred covenant before God. It is meant to reflect the perfect love between Christ and His church. When a man and woman stand before the congregation, they represent that divine beauty and grace." He paused, adjusting his spectacles. "Your appearance, Miss Ashford, would be a distraction from that sacred moment. It would cause discomfort among the congregation. Some might even see it as a poor omen for the marriage itself." Eleanor felt the words like physical blows. Thomas stiffened beside her. "Reverend, surely you cannot mean—" "I cannot in good conscience perform a ceremony that would disturb the peace and sanctity of our church," Reverend Caldwell continued, his tone matter of fact, as if he were discussing nothing more significant than the weather. "Perhaps you might seek a private ceremony elsewhere, or consider a civil union at the courthouse." "But we want to be married in the sight of God," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "We want His blessing." "Then perhaps you should consider why God allowed such a mark to be placed upon you," the Reverend said. "We cannot always understand His purposes, but we must accept His will." Thomas stood abruptly, his face flushed with anger. "You call yourself a man of God? Christ healed the lepers, welcomed the outcasts?" "Do not presume to lecture me on Scripture, Mr. Greene," the Reverend said sharply. "My decision is final. I will not perform this marriage in my church." They left the office in stunned silence. Eleanor could not stop shaking, could not catch her breath. Thomas guided her out into the autumn sunlight, his arm around her shoulders. But she could feel him trembling too, whether from rage or shock she could not tell. They walked without speaking, moving away from the church, away from the town center, until they reached the river where the water rushed over smooth stones and the cottonwoods whispered overhead. "We will go to the courthouse," Thomas said finally. "We do not need him." But Eleanor was crying great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep inside her. "He said God marked me. He said I'm not fit to stand in his house. He is wrong. He is a cruel, small man who knows nothing of God's true nature." Thomas held her, but his words felt hollow. They both knew that Reverend Caldwell spoke for most of Spokane, that his rejection was simply the most honest expression of what everyone else thought but would not say aloud. Eleanor pulled away, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. "I cannot marry you like this. I cannot tie you to someone who is shut out from decent society, who will bring shame to you wherever we go." "Eleanor, no." "I release you from your promise, Thomas." Her voice was steady now, though tears still streamed down her ruined face. "Find someone whole. Find someone who can stand beside you without people turning away in disgust. I do not want anyone else. But I cannot do this to you. I cannot be the reason you are pitied or mocked." She turned and walked away, leaving him standing by the river, and she did not look back, though he called her name again and again. Eleanor returned to the boarding house and told Mrs. Patterson she was unwell. She climbed the narrow stairs to the small room under the eaves where she slept, and she lay on the bed and stared at the ceiling and wondered if it would have been better if that bullet had killed her 3 years ago. She did not eat dinner that night, did not light the lamp when darkness fell. She simply lay there, feeling hollowed out, feeling as though the last fragile hope she had been clinging to had finally been ripped away. The next day, she rose before dawn and went about her duties mechanically, stripping beds and scrubbing floors and emptying chamber pots. Mrs. Patterson watched her with worried eyes, but said nothing. Thomas came by in the evening, but Eleanor refused to see him. He came back the next day and the day after that, and each time she sent word through Mrs. Patterson that she could not speak with him. On the 4th day, he stopped coming. October faded into November, and the first snows began to fall on the mountains that ringed Spokane. Eleanor went through her days like a sleepwalker, speaking only when necessary, eating only enough to keep herself alive. She attended church on Sundays, sitting in the back pew, listening to Reverend Caldwell preach about grace and mercy and the love of God, and she felt nothing but a vast emptiness where her faith had once been. It was on a cold morning in late November when everything changed. Eleanor was hanging laundry in the backyard of the boarding house, her fingers numb despite her gloves, when she heard shouting from the street. She hurried around the side of the building and saw a crowd gathering near the blacksmith's shop. A horse had bolted, dragging a wagon behind it, and in the chaos, a young boy had been knocked down. He lay in the street, screaming, his leg bent at an unnatural angle. Eleanor did not think. She ran forward, pushing through the crowd, dropping to her knees beside the boy. He was perhaps 7 years old, his face white with shock and pain. "Someone get the doctor," she shouted, and her voice cut through the chaos with unexpected authority. She stripped off her shawl and used it to cushion the boy's head, speaking to him in low, soothing tones. "You are going to be fine. The doctor is coming. Just breathe, sweetheart, just breathe." The boy's mother appeared, sobbing hysterically, and Eleanor caught her hands. "He needs you to be calm. He needs you to be strong for him. Can you do that?" The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face, and Eleanor guided her to kneel beside her son, to hold his hand and whisper reassurance. It was then that Eleanor became aware of someone else kneeling on the other side of the boy. She looked up and found herself staring into a pair of dark brown eyes that were filled with concern and focus. The man was in his mid-20s, with sun-bronzed skin and black hair that fell nearly to his shoulders. He wore dusty trail clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that had been pushed back on his head. A cowboy, Eleanor thought distantly, one of the many who passed through Spokane on their way to or from the cattle ranches that dotted the territory. I need to stabilize the leg before we move him, the man said, his voice calm and steady. He had a slight accent, something Eleanor could not quite place. Can you help me? Eleanor nodded. Together they worked, the stranger pulling off his leather belt and using it along with 2 straight pieces of wood from a broken crate to fashion a makeshift splint. His hands were quick and sure, and he spoke constantly to the boy, telling him he was brave, telling him the worst was almost over. By the time Dr. Morrison arrived with his black bag, the leg was secured and the boy had stopped screaming, though he still whimpered with pain. Doctor, Morrison took over, directing several men to lift the boy carefully and carry him to the doctor's office down the street. The crowd began to disperse, the excitement over, people returning to their daily business. Eleanor stood slowly, her dress filthy, her hands shaking now that the crisis had passed. You did well, the stranger said. He had retrieved his belt and was buckling it back around his waist. You kept him from going into shock. That may have saved his life. You knew what to do with the leg, Eleanor replied. Are you a doctor? No, madam, just a cowboy who has seen his share of broken bones. He smiled, and it transformed his face, making him look younger and more approachable. Name is Harrison Ortega. Eleanor Ashford. She waited for it, for the moment when his eyes would focus on the left side of her face, when the warmth in his expression would fade into discomfort or pity or revulsion. But Harrison simply held out his hand, and when she took it, his grip was firm and respectful. Pleasure to meet you, Miss Ashford. That was quick thinking back there. Most people just stand around gaping when something bad happens. I have been a nurse before, Eleanor said, though it was not entirely true. She had helped care for her mother during a long illness years ago, and she had learned a few things from Dr. Morrison when she had been recovering from her own injury, but she had never been formally trained. Still, something in Harrison's presence made her want to seem more capable, more worthy of his respect. Well, that boy is lucky you were here. Harrison glanced up at the sky where gray clouds were gathering. Looks like more snow coming. I should get my horse settled before it starts. He touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of farewell. Maybe I will see you around town, Miss Ashford. Maybe, Eleanor said, though she did not expect it. Cowboys came and went like tumbleweeds, here one day and gone the next, chasing work or adventure or whatever it was that men like that chased. But Harrison did not leave Spokane. Eleanor saw him the next day, riding down Main Street on a big bay gelding with white stockings. She saw him 2 days later coming out of the general store with a sack of supplies. Each time, he tipped his hat to her, and each time she felt a strange flutter in her chest that she tried to ignore. On the 4th day, she was sweeping the porch of the boarding house when he rode up and dismounted. Good morning, Miss Ashford, he said, tying his horse to the hitching post. Good morning, Mr. Ortega. Are you looking for a room? Actually, I was looking for you. He climbed the steps to the porch, moving with the easy grace of a man who spent most of his life on horseback. I heard in town that you are good with your hands, that you know herbs and healing. I have a friend who is sick, and I was hoping you might take a look at him. Eleanor blinked in surprise. I am not a doctor, Mr. Ortega. I truly am not qualified. Dr. Morrison is out at the Henderson Ranch, will not be back until tomorrow. My friend is burning up with fever, and I do not know what to do for him. There was genuine worry in Harrison's eyes. Please, Miss Ashford, I would not ask if I was not desperate. Eleanor hesitated. She thought of Reverend Caldwell's words, of all the ways she had been told she was not fit for decent society. But Harrison was looking at her as if she were his only hope, as if her scars meant nothing compared to the skills he believed she possessed. All right, she said quietly, let me get my cloak and tell Mrs. Patterson where I'm going. They rode together through the streets of Spokane, Eleanor perched behind Harrison on his horse, her arms around his waist, trying not to think about how solid and warm he felt, how the scent of leather and sage seemed to cling to him. He took her to a small cabin on the outskirts of town, near where the railroad was slowly pushing through the valley. A thin stream of smoke rose from the chimney. Inside, a man lay on a narrow bed, his face flushed and his breathing labored. Harrison introduced him as Carlos, another cowboy who had been working with him on a cattle drive from Montana down to Oregon. They had stopped in Spokane to rest and resupply, and Carlos had fallen ill 2 days ago. Eleanor knelt beside the bed and placed her hand on Carlos's forehead. He was burning with fever, muttering incoherently in Spanish. She pulled back the blankets and examined him as best she could while preserving his modesty. His neck was stiff, and when she asked Harrison to bring the lamp closer, she saw a rash spreading across his chest. "How long has he had the rash?" she asked. "I noticed it this morning. Is it serious?" Eleanor sat back on her heels thinking. Her mother had suffered from scarlet fever when Eleanor was 16, and the symptoms had been similar. "I think it might be scarlet fever. It is very contagious. Have you been feeling unwell at all?" Harrison shook his head. "I feel fine." "You may have already had it as a child then. Many people do, and once you have had it, you cannot get it again." Eleanor stood and began looking around the cabin, taking stock of what supplies were available. "We need to bring the fever down. Do you have any willow bark?" "No, but I can get some." "Good. And I need clean cloths, cool water, and if you can get some honey and lemon, that would help." Eleanor rolled up her sleeves, suddenly feeling more alive than she had in weeks. Here was something she could do, something that mattered. Here was a person who needed her, and it had nothing to do with her face or what the Reverend thought of her. Harrison hurried out to gather supplies, and Eleanor set to work. She stripped Carlos down to his union suit and began sponging his body with cool water, trying to bring down the dangerous fever. She spoke to him in a low voice, though she did not know if he could hear her, telling him he was going to be all right, that she was going to take care of him. Harrison returned with everything she had requested and more, including a bag of peppermint that the general store owner's wife had insisted he take. Together they worked through the day and into the night, taking turns watching over Carlos, forcing him to drink willow bark tea whenever he was conscious enough to swallow. Eleanor showed Harrison how to make poultices to draw out the fever, how to check for signs that the illness was worsening. It was near midnight when Carlos's fever finally broke. He opened his eyes, confused and weak but lucid, and asked for water. Eleanor helped him drink, relief flooding through her. Harrison slumped in his chair, exhausted, but he was grinning. "You saved his life," he said to Eleanor. "We do not know that. He might have recovered on his own." "No, I watched my brother die of a fever when I was 12 years old. I know what it looks like when someone is not going to make it. You brought him back." Eleanor did not know what to say. She felt Harrison's gaze on her, warm and admiring, and it made her uncomfortable in a way she could not name. She stood quickly. "I should go. Mrs. Patterson will be worried." "It is the middle of the night. Let me ride you back." Harrison stood as well, stretching his tall frame. "Carlos will sleep now. He will be all right until morning." They rode back through the silent streets, the stars brilliant overhead in the cold November sky. When they reached the boarding house, Harrison helped Eleanor down from the horse, his hands strong around her waist. For a moment they stood close together, their breath misting in the frigid air. "Thank you," Harrison said softly. "I will not forget this." "You are welcome." Eleanor stepped back, suddenly shy. "I hope Carlos continues to improve." "Would you come check on him tomorrow? I would pay you, of course." "You do not need to pay me," Eleanor said quickly. "But yes, I will come." She went inside, her heart pounding, and she realized she was smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. She did not let herself wonder why Harrison's gratitude meant so much to her. Did not let herself think about the way his eyes had lingered on her face without any trace of disgust. She simply held the feeling close, a small warm light in the darkness that had surrounded her for so long. Eleanor visited Carlos every day for a week, bringing food from the boarding house, checking his temperature, making sure the rash was fading properly. Harrison was always there, usually working on some project around the cabin, fixing the sagging porch or patching holes in the roof. He would stop whatever he was doing when she arrived, making her coffee, asking her questions about medicine and healing, telling her stories about his life on the trail. She learned that he was 25 years old, the son of a Mexican mother and an Irish father, both of whom had died when Harrison was young. He had grown up on a ranch in Texas, had learned to ride before he could walk, and had been working cattle drives for the past 8 years. He was saving money to buy his own spread someday, a small ranch where he could raise horses and settle down. "Do you miss it?" Eleanor asked one afternoon. "Always moving, never staying in one place?" Harrison considered the question, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. "Sometimes I miss the freedom of it, the way the world feels big and full of possibilities when you're riding across open country. But I am getting tired of never having a home, of sleeping on the ground more often than in a bed. I want to wake up in the same place every morning, to know my neighbors, to plant trees and watch them grow." He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "What about you, Miss Ashford? What do you want?" No one had asked her that in a long time. Eleanor stared into her own coffee, watching the steam rise. "I want to matter to someone. I want to have a family, to have children who will love me and depend on me. I want to feel like I belong somewhere." She laughed bitterly. Simple things, really. Things most people take for granted. Why should you not have those things? Eleanor touched her face, the scarred side tracing the puckered line with her fingertips. "You know why?" "I know a scared, ignorant preacher refused to marry you in his church. That does not mean you cannot have the life you want." She looked up sharply. "How did you know about that?" Harrison had the grace to look embarrassed. "Small town. People talk. I heard about it at the saloon." "Then you know that I am not fit to be anyone's wife, that my appearance is a distraction from God's grace, that I am marked." The words came out harsh and bitter. "I know that Reverend Caldwell is a fool who understands nothing about grace or God or what really matters in this world." Harrison set down his coffee and leaned forward, his elbows on his knees. "I have known beautiful women, Miss Ashford. Women who could stop a man's heart just by walking into a room, and most of them were cold and cruel and empty inside. You are not any of those things. You barely know me. I know you ran to help a child in danger when everyone else just stood around. I know you sat up all night caring for a sick man you had never met. I know you are kind and smart and braver than you give yourself credit for." He reached out and took her hand, and the touch sent electricity up her arm. "I know that when I look at you, I do not see scars. I see a woman worth knowing." Eleanor pulled her hand away, standing abruptly. "You are just grateful because I helped your friend. That is all this is. Is that what you think? I do not know what to think." She felt panicked suddenly, trapped. "I should go. Carlos is doing well enough that you do not need me anymore." She fled before Harrison could respond, hurrying out into the cold afternoon, nearly running back toward town. She felt like a coward, but she could not help it. Harrison's words had cracked something open inside her, had let hope slip in, and she could not bear the thought of that hope being crushed again. Better to run, better to protect herself, better to accept that she was meant to be alone. But Harrison Ortega was not a man who gave up easily. The next morning he appeared at the boarding house with a bouquet of wild flowers that must have taken him hours to find in the late November landscape. Mrs. Patterson called Eleanor down from her room, her eyes twinkling with amusement and approval. Harrison stood in the parlor, his hat in his hands, the flowers held awkwardly in front of him. "Miss Ashford, I want to apologize if I made you uncomfortable yesterday. That was not my intention." Eleanor descended the stairs slowly, very aware of Mrs. Patterson hovering in the doorway to the kitchen, pretending to dust a table that was already spotless. "You did not make me uncomfortable, Mr. Ortega. I simply needed to get back to my work." "I do not believe you." He said it gently, without accusation. "I think I scared you, and I'm sorry for that, but I'm not sorry for meaning what I said." He held out the flowers. "Would you do me the honor of taking a walk with me? I promise to behave with perfect propriety." Eleanor knew she should refuse. She knew she was setting herself up for heartbreak, that this could only end badly. But the hopeful look in Harrison's eyes, the way he stood there so earnest and vulnerable, made it impossible to say no. She took the flowers, their stems tied with a piece of rawhide. "All right, let me get my cloak." They walked through Spokane in the cold winter sunlight, past the church and the general store, past the saloon where tinny piano music drifted out into the street, down to the river where the cottonwoods stood bare and skeletal against the sky. Harrison talked about his plans for the future, about the kind of ranch he wanted to own, about breeding horses that would be strong and smart and beautiful. Eleanor found herself talking too, telling him about her childhood on a farm in Missouri, about her parents who had died of cholera when she was 17, about coming west to live with an aunt in Spokane. "That is when you got hurt?" Harrison asked, nodding toward her scarred face. "3 years after I arrived. I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A stray bullet from a fight I had nothing to do with." Eleanor pulled her hair back, showing him the full extent of the damage. "I was pretty once. People said I looked like my mother, that I would have no trouble finding a husband." Harrison studied her face, his gaze traveling over the scars with clinical detachment, as if he were assessing an injured horse. "You are still pretty," he said finally. "The scars do not change that. They just make you more interesting to look at." Eleanor laughed despite herself. "You are very kind, Mr. Ortega." "I am not being kind. I am being honest." He stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Miss Ashford, I want to court you properly. I want to take you to dinner, to bring you flowers, to walk with you on Sunday afternoons. I want to get to know you better, and I want you to get to know me. And if, after a time, we find that we suit each other, suit each, I would like to ask you to marry me." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. "Mr. Ortega, you cannot be serious." "Why not?" "Because you could have any woman you wanted, because I am damaged goods, because the preacher already said—" "To hell with what the preacher said." Harrison's voice was fierce. "I do not need his permission to know my own heart, and I do not care what anyone else in this town thinks. I care what you think. So I am asking you, Eleanor Ashford, will you let me court you?" She wanted to say yes. Every part of her was screaming yes. But the fear was still there. The certainty that this was too good to be true, that she would open her heart only to have it shattered again. "I need time to think about it," she whispered. "Take all the time you need." Harrison smiled, that warm, transformative smile that made her knees weak. "I am not going anywhere." But he did have to go somewhere, at least temporarily. 2 days later, he rode out to the ranch where he had been doing odd jobs, helping with the winter preparations, cutting firewood and repairing fences. He was gone for a week, and in his absence, Eleanor thought about nothing but his proposal. She analyzed it from every angle, looking for the catch, the hidden motive, the reason why a man like Harrison would want a woman like her. Mrs. Patterson had no such doubts. "That young man is smitten with you, dear," she said as they folded laundry together. "I have seen the way he looks at you. Like you are the answer to a question he has been asking his whole life." "But why? There are so many other women who would be better suited to him." "Maybe he does not want what everyone else considers suitable. Maybe he wants someone real, someone with depth and character, someone who has been through fire and come out stronger on the other side." "Mrs." Patterson patted Eleanor's hand. "You have been hiding for too long, child. That bullet took part of your face, but you cannot let it take your whole life." The words stayed with Eleanor, echoing in her mind. When Harrison returned to Spokane the following week, she was waiting for him on the porch of the boarding house. He dismounted and climbed the steps, his eyes questioning. "Yes," Eleanor said before she could lose her nerve. "Yes, I will let you court me." Harrison's face lit up with such pure joy that Eleanor felt tears spring to her eyes. He took her hands, holding them carefully, as if she were made of something precious and fragile. "You will not regret this. I promise you, Eleanor. I will do everything in my power to make you happy." And for the first time in 3 years, Eleanor believed that happiness might actually be possible. The courtship that followed was unlike anything Eleanor had experienced with Thomas Greene. Where Thomas had been cautious and almost apologetic, Harrison was confident and proud. He walked with Eleanor through the center of town at midday when everyone could see them. He sat with her at church, ignoring the stares and whispers. He took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, the finest establishment in Spokane, and he pulled out her chair and ordered wine as if they were a normal courting couple, and there was nothing at all unusual about them. At first, Eleanor was painfully self-conscious, certain that everyone was judging them, that the town was laughing behind their backs, but Harrison never seemed to notice or care. He focused entirely on her, asking her questions, listening intently to her answers, making her laugh with stories about disastrous cattle drives and ornery horses. Gradually, Eleanor began to relax, began to forget about the stares and whispers, began to simply enjoy being with him. They spent Christmas together, exchanging small gifts. Eleanor gave Harrison a muffler she had knitted, soft gray wool that would keep him warm on cold rides. Harrison gave her a book of poetry by Walt Whitman, something Eleanor had mentioned wanting to read. Inside the cover, he had written in careful script, "For Eleanor, who understands that true beauty comes from the soul. With deepest admiration, Harrison." On New Year's Eve, they stood together watching fireworks that some enterprising merchant had brought in from Seattle. And when the clock struck midnight, Harrison kissed her for the first time. It was gentle and sweet, his lips warm against hers, his hand cradling the scarred side of her face, as if it were something beautiful. Eleanor kissed him back, tears streaming down her cheeks, feeling something inside her that had been broken and frozen begin to thaw and heal. January brought bitter cold and deep snow, but it also brought a deepening of their relationship. Harrison spent every free moment with Eleanor, and she found herself falling helplessly in love with him. She loved his quiet strength, his unshakable confidence, the way he treated everyone with respect regardless of their station. She loved his laugh, deep and genuine, and the way his eyes crinkled at the corners. She loved that he never made her feel like a burden or an embarrassment, that he seemed genuinely proud to be seen with her. In late January, as they sat together in the parlor of the boarding house, Harrison took her hand. "Eleanor, I know we have not been courting for very long, but I am sure of my feelings. I want to spend my life with you. Will you marry me?" Eleanor had been expecting the question, but her heart still raced. "Yes," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Yes, Harrison, I will marry you." He kissed her then deeply and thoroughly, and Mrs. Patterson had to clear her throat loudly from the doorway to remind them they were not yet wed. They broke apart laughing, and Harrison produced a simple gold band from his pocket. It had belonged to his mother, he explained, the only thing he had left from her. Eleanor slipped it on her finger, marveling at how perfectly it fit. "When?" she asked. "When should we marry?" "As soon as possible. Tomorrow, if you like." Eleanor laughed. "We need time to plan, to prepare, and we need to find someone to perform the ceremony." The laughter died in her throat as she remembered. "Harrison, Reverend Caldwell, will not marry us." "Then we will not ask him? But who else is there? He's the only minister in Spokane." Harrison's jaw set in a stubborn line. "Then we will find another way. We will go to the courthouse and have a civil ceremony." Eleanor shook her head. "I want a real wedding, Harrison. I want to be married in a church with God's blessing. I want to stand before a minister and say my vows." "Then that is what we will have," Harrison said firmly. "I do not know how yet, but I promise you, Eleanor, you will have the wedding you deserve." He spent the next 2 days making inquiries, but the news was not good. The nearest other church was in Cheney, 20 miles away, and their minister had broken his leg and was not performing ceremonies. The circuit preacher, who sometimes came through the area, would not return until spring. The Catholic priest in the settlement near the Coeur d'Alene reservation might marry them, but it would require a long journey and conversion to Catholicism, something neither Harrison nor Eleanor wanted. Eleanor tried to resign herself to a courthouse wedding, tried to tell herself it did not matter, that the important thing was being married to Harrison. But it did matter. After everything she had been through, after being told she was not worthy of God's house, she desperately wanted to prove Reverend Caldwell wrong. She wanted to stand in a chapel and declare her love before God, and know that she was blessed and accepted. Harrison could see her distress, and it ate at him. He paced their small cabin like a caged animal, thinking, planning. Finally, on a Wednesday morning in early February, he came to the boarding house with a determined look on his face. "I have an idea," he told Eleanor, "but you have to trust me." "I do trust you." "Good. Then do not ask questions, just know that you are going to have your church wedding." He would not say more, no matter how she pressed him. Instead, he kissed her and rode off, leaving Eleanor mystified and curious. She did not see him for 3 days, and when he finally returned, he was sunburned despite the winter cold and looked exhausted but triumphant. "I found a place," he announced, "about 10 miles south of here, near the river. It is perfect." "A place for what?" "For a chapel. I am going to build you a church, Eleanor, a place where we can be married with God's blessing, where no one can tell you that you are not worthy." Eleanor stared at him in shock. "Harrison, you cannot build a church. That would take months and money, and I already started." He was grinning now, looking boyish and excited. "I filed a claim on the land, bought lumber from the mill, and hired 3 men to help me. We can have it done in 6 weeks if we work hard." 6 weeks? Eleanor felt dizzy. "Harrison, this is madness." "Maybe, but it is madness for a good cause." He took her hands. "You deserve to be married in a chapel, Eleanor. If Reverend Caldwell will not open his doors to you, then I will build new doors. I will build you a church that will be ours, where we will say our vows and where we will bring our children to be baptized, a place that will always welcome us." Eleanor could not speak. She threw her arms around his neck and held him tight, overwhelmed by the extravagance of his gesture, by the depth of his love for her. "You would do this for me?" she whispered. "I would do anything for you," Harrison replied simply. True to his word, Harrison threw himself into the project with single-minded determination. He spent dawn to dusk at the building site, working alongside the men he had hired, sawing and hammering and hauling. Eleanor visited whenever she could, bringing food and hot coffee, watching in amazement as the structure took shape. It was not a large chapel, just a simple rectangular building with a peaked roof and a small bell tower, but it was sturdy and well-made, built with care and love. Word spread through Spokane about what Harrison was doing, and reactions were mixed. Some people thought it was romantic, a grand gesture worthy of a storybook. Others thought it was foolish, a waste of time and money. Reverend Caldwell, when he heard, preached a sermon about pride and the sin of believing one could create sacred space through human effort alone. But Harrison did not care what anyone thought. He worked with steady focus, shaping wood and driving nails, creating something beautiful out of raw materials and sheer determination. Eleanor marveled at his skill, at the way he could look at a pile of lumber and see a chapel, at the way his hands could transform his vision into reality. As February turned into March, the chapel neared completion. Harrison installed windows that he had ordered from Seattle, clear glass that let sunlight stream in and illuminate the simple interior. He built pews from smooth pine, 8 rows on each side of a central aisle. He carved a cross from a single piece of cedar and mounted it on the wall behind where the altar would stand. But there was still one problem, and it was a significant one. Even with a chapel built, they had no one to perform the marriage ceremony. Harrison wrote letters to ministers in other towns, but the responses were all the same. They were too far away, or too busy, or they had heard about Eleanor's scars and did not want to become involved in a controversial marriage. Eleanor tried not to let her disappointment show, but Harrison could read it in her face. "We will find someone," he promised. "There has to be a minister somewhere who will help us." The answer came from an unexpected source. Carlos, Harrison's friend who Eleanor had nursed back to health, had been working odd jobs around Spokane while he regained his strength. He mentioned the situation to a man he met at the saloon who mentioned it to someone else, and eventually word reached the Coeur d'Alene tribe that lived on the reservation to the east. A week before the chapel was finished, a rider came to find Harrison. He was a young native man named Many Horses, and he brought a message from his community. There was a man living among the Coeur d'Alene, a former Methodist minister named Josiah Whitefield, who had left his congregation in Portland 5 years ago to become a missionary to the tribes. He was known as a good man, kind and wise, and he still performed marriage ceremonies for those who asked. He would be willing to marry Harrison and Eleanor if they wanted his help. Harrison brought the news to Eleanor, who felt a surge of hope so strong it almost hurt. "Do you think he means it? He will really marry us?" "There is only one way to find out. We should go meet him, talk to him, make sure he understands the situation." They made the journey to the reservation 2 days later, riding through the cold March morning, watching their breath mist in the air. The Coeur d'Alene settlement was small but well organized, with sturdy lodges and cultivated fields that would be planted when spring truly arrived. They were greeted with cautious curiosity, and Many Horses took them to meet Josiah Whitefield. The former minister was in his 60s, with a weathered face and kind gray eyes. He listened to their story without interruption, studying both of them carefully. When they finished, he was quiet for a long moment. "Reverend Caldwell refused to marry you because of your scars?" he asked Eleanor. "Yes, sir. He said my appearance would be a distraction from the sacred nature of the ceremony." Josiah Whitefield shook his head sadly. "I knew Caldwell in Portland many years ago. He was always more concerned with appearances than with souls. I'm sorry he hurt you so deeply." "Will you marry us?" Harrison asked bluntly. "Will you come to the chapel I built and perform the ceremony?" "Young man, you built an entire church just so this woman could have the wedding she deserved. That shows the kind of love that Christ spoke of, the kind that puts another person's needs and dreams above your own comfort." Josiah smiled. "Yes, I will marry you. It would be my honor." Eleanor felt tears spill down her cheeks, and Harrison squeezed her hand so tight it almost hurt. They made arrangements for the wedding to take place on the first Saturday in April, giving them time to finish the chapel and make final preparations. As they rode back to Spokane, Eleanor felt lighter than she had in years, as if a weight she had been carrying had finally been lifted. The final weeks passed in a blur of activity. Eleanor sewed her wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of cream-colored silk that Mrs. Patterson had stored in her attic for years, left over from her own daughter's wedding. Harrison finished the chapel, adding final touches, oil finishing the pews until they gleamed, hanging a brass bell in the tower that rang clear and bright when he pulled the rope. The day before the wedding, Harrison took Eleanor to see the completed chapel. It stood in a meadow near the river, surrounded by pine trees, looking small and perfect against the backdrop of mountains still capped with snow. The afternoon sun made the windows glow like amber, and when they stepped inside, the space was filled with warm golden light. "It is beautiful," Eleanor breathed. "Harrison, it is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." "Not quite," Harrison said, looking at her, "but close." They walked down the aisle hand in hand, imagining the ceremony that would take place the next day. Harrison had invited everyone from Spokane, though he did not know how many would actually come. Eleanor had invited Mrs. Patterson and a few of the other women from the boarding house who had been kind to her over the years. Carlos would be there, of course, and the men who had helped build the chapel. Josiah Whitefield would arrive in the morning to perform the ceremony. "Are you nervous?" Harrison asked. "Terrified," Eleanor admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if Josiah does not come? What if—" Harrison silenced her with a kiss. "Nothing will go wrong. Tomorrow you are going to put on that beautiful dress, and you are going to walk down this aisle, and you are going to marry me in this chapel that was built for you and you alone, and it is going to be perfect." And it was. The morning of April 2nd, 1882 dawned clear and cold with a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. Eleanor dressed carefully, her hands shaking as she fastened the buttons on her gown. Mrs. Patterson helped her with her hair, pinning it up in an elegant twist and weaving in wild flowers that Harrison had picked the day before. Eleanor looked at herself in the mirror and saw a bride, not a scarred woman, not someone to be pitied or hidden away, but simply a woman in love about to marry the man she adored. They arrived at the chapel to find it already surrounded by wagons and horses. Eleanor's heart swelled when she realized that half of Spokane had come. Not just the few people she had invited, but dozens of townsfolk who had heard the story and wanted to witness the wedding. They filled the pews and stood along the walls, and when Eleanor appeared in the doorway on Mrs. Patterson's arm, a murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Harrison stood at the front of the chapel beside Josiah Whitefield, wearing a new black suit that made him look startlingly handsome and formal. When he saw Eleanor, his face transformed with such love and awe that she had to blink back tears. She walked down the aisle slowly, taking in the faces of the people who had come to celebrate with them, and she felt surrounded by goodwill and blessing. The ceremony was simple but deeply moving. Josiah spoke about love as the foundation of faith, about how Christ commanded his followers to love one another without judgment or condition. He spoke about marriage as a partnership, about two people becoming one flesh, about the commitment to stand together through all the joys and sorrows life might bring. When it came time for the vows, Harrison spoke in a clear, strong voice, promising to love Eleanor, to honor and cherish her, to be faithful to her all the days of his life. Eleanor repeated the words, her voice wavering with emotion, and when Harrison slipped the wedding band on her finger to join the engagement ring already there, she felt as though her heart might burst with happiness. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," Josiah said, smiling. "Harrison, you may kiss your bride." Harrison pulled Eleanor into his arms and kissed her deeply, and the chapel erupted in applause and cheers. Someone rang the bell in the tower, and its joyful peal carried across the valley, announcing to the world that a wedding had taken place, that two people had joined their lives in love and commitment. The celebration that followed was spontaneous and exuberant. People had brought food and drink, and tables were set up outside the chapel where everyone gathered to eat and toast the newlyweds. Musicians appeared with fiddles and guitars, and dancing began in the meadow, couples whirling under the spring sky. Eleanor found herself passed from partner to partner, laughing breathlessly, her husband always nearby, watching her with that look of wonder and love that never seemed to fade. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Reverend Caldwell appeared at the edge of the gathering. He stood apart from the celebration, watching with a sour expression. Harrison saw him and stiffened, but Eleanor placed a hand on his arm. "Let me speak to him," she said quietly. She crossed the meadow to where the Reverend stood, her wedding dress rustling in the evening breeze. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. "You got your church wedding," Reverend Caldwell said finally. "Are you satisfied now?" "I am happy," Eleanor replied. "Happier than I ever thought I could be. My husband loves me and I love him, and we were married with God's blessing in a chapel built with love and devotion. Yes, I am satisfied. He will tire of you eventually. When the novelty wears off, when he has to look at that face every day for the rest of his life." "You are wrong," Eleanor interrupted, and there was steel in her voice. "My husband does not see scars when he looks at me. He sees the woman he loves. He sees someone worth building a chapel for, worth fighting for, worth spending his life with." "I am sorry that you cannot understand that, Reverend. I am sorry that your faith is so small and mean that it cannot make room for love that looks beyond the surface. But that is your failing, not mine." She turned and walked back to Harrison, leaving Reverend Caldwell standing alone. Her husband held out his hand, and she took it, and together they rejoined the celebration. They danced together as the stars came out, and Eleanor felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. The party continued until well past midnight, but eventually people began to drift away, heading back to their homes and farms, calling out congratulations and well wishes. Harrison and Eleanor were left alone with Carlos and Mrs. Patterson, who helped clean up the remnants of the celebration. "Where will you go tonight?" Mrs. Patterson asked, a knowing twinkle in her eye. I rented a room at the hotel, Harrison said. Tomorrow we will start making more permanent plans. He had already told Eleanor that he wanted to build them a house near the chapel, a real home where they could raise a family. The land he had claimed was fertile and well-watered, perfect for a small ranch. He had enough money saved to buy a few horses to start breeding, and he could continue working cattle drives in the summer to supplement their income until the ranch became self-sustaining. They rode back to Spokane in the darkness. Eleanor perched in front of Harrison on his horse, his arms around her, both of them tired and happy and full of plans for the future. The hotel room was small but clean, with a comfortable bed and a window that looked out over the town. Harrison carried Eleanor over the threshold, and she laughed at the old-fashioned gesture. He set her down gently and cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs stroking her cheeks, tracing the lines of her scars with infinite tenderness. "My wife," he said softly. "My beautiful wife." Eleanor closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I never thought I would hear those words." "Get used to them. I plan to say them every day for the rest of our lives." They made love slowly and sweetly, learning each other, celebrating the bond they had just formalized. Eleanor felt cherished and desired in a way she had never experienced, and she gave herself to Harrison completely, without reservation or shame. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the darkness, talking and laughing and planning, reluctant to let sleep claim them and end this perfect day. The months that followed were busy and full of hard work. Harrison began building their house, a sturdy 2-story structure with a wide porch and big windows to let in light. Eleanor helped when she could, and she also began working with Josiah Whitefield, who had agreed to serve as the minister for their little chapel. Word spread about the church that welcomed everyone, and soon people were coming from miles around for Sunday services. Reverend Caldwell's congregation began to shrink as people transferred their loyalty to the new chapel in the meadow. Some came because they were curious, some because they believed in what Harrison and Eleanor represented, and some simply because Josiah's sermons were more inspiring and less judgmental than Caldwell's fire and brimstone. By summer, the small chapel was filled to capacity every Sunday, and Harrison had to build an addition to accommodate everyone. Eleanor found purpose and joy in her work with the chapel. She organized charitable efforts, collecting food and clothing for families in need. She taught Sunday school to children, telling them Bible stories and helping them learn to read. She visited the sick, using the healing knowledge she had developed over the years, and her reputation as a skilled nurse grew. People who had once avoided her or pitied her now sought her out, valuing her skills and her compassion. In late July, Eleanor realized she was pregnant. She told Harrison on a warm evening as they sat together on the porch of their nearly completed house, watching the sunset paint the sky. He was so overjoyed that he picked her up and spun her around, making her dizzy and laughing, before setting her down carefully as if she were made of glass. "We are going to have a baby," he kept saying, wonder in his voice. "We are going to be parents." "Are you happy?" Eleanor asked, though she could see the answer in his face. Happy does not begin to cover it. "You have given me everything, Eleanor, a home, a purpose, and now a child. I am the luckiest man alive." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, and Eleanor bloomed with health and happiness. Her belly swelled, and she felt the baby move inside her, strong kicks and rolls that made her laugh. Harrison was attentive and doting, refusing to let her do any heavy work, bringing her wildflowers and treats from town, talking to her belly as if the baby could already hear him. In March of 1883, almost exactly a year after their wedding, Eleanor went into labor. It was a long and difficult birth, lasting through the night and into the next day. Mrs. Patterson attended her, along with a midwife from town, and Harrison paced outside, praying and worrying. Finally, as the sun was setting, Eleanor delivered a healthy baby boy with dark hair and eyes that would eventually settle into the same warm brown as his father's. They named him Samuel, after Harrison's father, and he was perfect. Harrison held his son with tears streaming down his face, marveling at the tiny fingers and toes, the way Samuel's hand wrapped around his thumb with surprising strength. Eleanor watched them together. exhausted but happier than she had ever been, and she thanked God for the unexpected blessings he had brought into her life. Samuel was a happy baby, easygoing and curious. He grew quickly, hitting milestones early, sitting up and crawling, and then walking before his first birthday. Harrison proved to be a devoted father, patient and playful, spending every free moment with his son. The ranch was doing well, with a growing herd of horses that were gaining a reputation for quality and temperament. Money was still tight, but they had enough, and they had each other, which was all that really mattered. When Samuel was 18 months old, Eleanor discovered she was pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was easier, and in the spring of 1885 she delivered twin girls. They named them Grace and Hope, and they were identical, with their mother's golden hair and green eyes. Harrison joked that he was outnumbered now 3-1, but his pride in his daughters was obvious. He doted on them shamelessly, singing them lullabies and rocking them to sleep, refusing to complain about sleepless nights or dirty diapers. The chapel continued to thrive, becoming the heart of a growing community. People built houses near the church, forming a small settlement that they called Meadowbrook after the creek that ran through the valley. Harrison donated land for a school, and Eleanor helped organize its construction and hire a teacher. The settlement attracted families who wanted a place where everyone was welcome, where kindness mattered more than appearances, where faith was about love rather than judgment. Reverend Caldwell's church in Spokane dwindled until he was preaching to nearly empty pews. He tried to fight back, delivering sermons condemning the upstart chapel and the scarred woman who had bewitched the community, but his words fell on deaf ears. Eventually, in the summer of 1886, he resigned his position and left Spokane, moving back east where, people said, he took a position at a small country church far from anyone who knew about his failures. Eleanor felt no triumph at his departure, only a mild sadness that he had never learned to see beyond surfaces, that his faith had been too rigid to bend without breaking. She prayed for him sometimes, hoping he would find peace and wisdom, but mostly she was too busy living her own joyful life to think much about the past. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Samuel grew into a bright, energetic boy who loved horses as much as his father did. He spent hours at the corrals, learning to ride, helping care for the animals, absorbing everything Harrison could teach him. The twins were lively and mischievous, always getting into trouble, but they were also sweet and affectionate, wrapping both their parents around their tiny fingers. In 1888, when Samuel was 5 and the twins were 3, Eleanor gave birth to another son. They named him Daniel, and he was a quiet, thoughtful baby who seemed to observe everything with solemn, dark eyes. Harrison declared that their family was complete, and Eleanor agreed, content with their 4 children and the life they had built together. The ranch expanded over the years, with Harrison's horses becoming sought after throughout Washington Territory. He hired hands to help with the work, and Carlos became his foreman, loyal and hard-working, a trusted friend who was more like family. The house was expanded to accommodate their growing brood, with bedrooms added and a large kitchen where Eleanor spent hours cooking and baking, teaching her daughters to make bread and pies while Samuel and Daniel played on the floor. The chapel that Harrison had built for Eleanor's wedding became a landmark, a symbol of love's power to overcome prejudice and create beauty from rejection. People came from far away to see it, to hear the story of how a cowboy had built a church so he could marry the woman he loved despite a preacher's refusal. Artists painted it. Writers included it in their stories about the West, and it became a popular spot for weddings, with couples traveling long distances to exchange vows in the chapel built for love. Eleanor sometimes gave tours of the chapel, telling their story to visitors, and she always ended with the same words: "This building is proof that love can overcome anything, that kindness is stronger than cruelty, and that we should never let the small-minded judgments of others define our worth or limit our dreams." As the children grew, Eleanor made sure they understood the story behind their chapel, the reason it existed. She wanted them to know that their father had loved her enough to build a church when no one else would marry them, that he had seen past her scars to the woman beneath. She wanted them to grow up believing in love that was unconditional, in faith that was about acceptance rather than exclusion. Samuel, as the oldest, took the story to heart in a special way. When he was 10 years old, he asked his mother if her scars had hurt when she got them. Eleanor told him the truth, describing the pain and the long recovery, the way her face had healed crooked and strange. Samuel listened carefully, then reached out and traced the lines of her scars with his finger, just as his father often did. "I think they make you look brave," he said seriously, "like a warrior who survived a battle." Eleanor hugged him tight, tears in her eyes. "Thank you, sweetheart. That is a kind way to see it." "It is the true way to see it," Samuel insisted. "Papa always says that the best things in life come from surviving hard times and not giving up. Your scars show that you did not give up." The twins, Grace and Hope, were equally accepting, but in a more matter-of-fact way. They saw their mother's face as normal, having known nothing else, and they could not understand why anyone would have treated her badly because of it. When they were old enough to understand the full story, they were outraged on their mother's behalf, indignant that Reverend Caldwell had been so cruel. Daniel, the youngest, was the most sensitive of the children. He would sometimes climb into his mother's lap and touch her scars gently, as if checking to make sure they did not hurt anymore. Eleanor would hold him close and reassure him that she was fine, that the old wounds were long healed, that she was happy and loved and complete. Harrison continued to be Eleanor's greatest champion and most devoted admirer. Even after years of marriage, he still looked at her with wonder, still brought her flowers for no reason, still made time for walks by the river where they could talk and dream together. He never let her forget how much she meant to him, how grateful he was that she had taken a chance on him, how blessed he felt to share his life with her. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Harrison took Eleanor back to the chapel where they had been married. It was early April again, the same time of year, and the wildflowers were blooming in the meadow just as they had been on their wedding day. They stood together at the altar, holding hands, and Harrison pulled a folded piece of paper from his pocket. "I wrote new vows," he said. "I wanted to tell you what these 10 years have meant to me." He read them aloud, his voice thick with emotion, speaking of love that had grown deeper with time, of admiration for the mother she had become, of gratitude for every day they had spent together. He spoke of the joy she had brought into his life, the way she had made him a better man, the honor he felt in being her husband. By the time he finished, Eleanor was crying openly, and Harrison gently wiped away her tears. "Your turn," he said, handing her the paper he had written on and a pencil. Eleanor had not prepared anything, but the words came easily, flowing from her heart. She wrote quickly, then read aloud, speaking of the miracle he had been in her life, of how he had saved her when she was drowning in despair, of how he had shown her that love could be unconditional and true. She spoke of the life they had built together, of their children and their home and their church, of the community that had grown up around them. She spoke of looking forward to decades more together, to growing old beside him, to watching their children have children of their own. They renewed their vows there in the empty chapel, with no witnesses except God and each other, and then they made love in the soft afternoon light, christening the space with their devotion all over again. The years continued to pass, each one bringing new challenges and new joys. The children grew up strong and healthy, each developing their own personality and interests. Samuel became an accomplished horseman like his father, eventually taking over much of the day-to-day operation of the ranch. Grace developed a talent for music, learning to play the piano and leading the choir at the chapel. Hope had a gift for healing like her mother, apprenticing with Eleanor to learn about herbs and medicine. Daniel, the youngest, loved books and learning, and Eleanor and Harrison saved money to send him to school in Seattle when he was old enough. The ranch prospered, growing from a small operation to one of the most successful horse breeding establishments in Washington. Harrison developed several new bloodlines that were prized for their stamina and intelligence, and buyers came from as far away as California and Montana to purchase his stock. The family was comfortable financially, though never wealthy, and they used their resources to help others in the community, supporting the school and the chapel and families who fell on hard times. Eleanor's work with healing expanded as well. She studied everything she could find about medicine, ordering books from back east, corresponding with doctors and other healers. She set up a small clinic in Meadowbrook, offering her services for free or in trade for those who could not afford to pay. Her reputation spread, and people came from throughout the region seeking her help. She treated everything from broken bones to fevers to difficult pregnancies, and though she lost patients sometimes despite her best efforts, she saved far more than she lost. The chapel remained the center of their lives and their community. Josiah Whitefield served as minister until his death in 1895, and after him came a succession of ministers who shared his vision of a church built on love and acceptance. The building was expanded twice more to accommodate the growing congregation, but the original chapel that Harrison had built remained at the heart of it, preserved exactly as it had been on Eleanor and Harrison's wedding day. On their 25th wedding anniversary in 1907, the community threw a huge celebration in honor of Eleanor and Harrison. The chapel was packed with people who had known them for decades, whose lives had been touched by their kindness and example. Samuel, now 24 and recently married himself, gave a speech about his parents and the legacy they had created. He spoke of the love that had built a church, of the faith that had overcome prejudice, of the family that had become the foundation of an entire community. Eleanor and Harrison stood together, their hair now streaked with gray, their faces lined with age, holding hands as they had on their wedding day. Eleanor still bore her scars, more faded now but still visible, and Harrison still looked at her as if she were the most beautiful woman in the world. They had survived droughts and harsh winters, illness and injury, the normal struggles that came with raising children and running a ranch. But they had survived together, their love growing stronger with each challenge they faced. "We are blessed," Harrison said quietly, his arm around Eleanor's waist as they watched their children and grandchildren, already two of those from Samuel and his wife, playing in the meadow outside the chapel. "More blessed than I ever could have imagined." "We made our own blessing," Eleanor replied. "We refused to let others define what was possible for us. We built something beautiful from rejection and pain. We created a family and a community out of love." "I would do it all again," Harrison said. "Every bit of it, every hard moment, every struggle, just to end up right here with you." Eleanor turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "I love you, Harrison Ortega. I have loved you from the moment you knelt beside that injured boy and asked me to help. I will love you until I draw my last breath and beyond. And I love you, Eleanor Ortega. You are my heart, my home, my everything." They kissed, surrounded by the people they loved, in the shadow of the chapel that had been built as a testament to their love. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, and the bell in the tower rang out, clear and joyful, announcing to the world that love had won, that kindness had triumphed, that two people who had refused to give up on their dreams had created something that would last for generations. The twins, Grace and Hope, now 22, performed a duet they had prepared, their voices blending in perfect harmony. Daniel, 19 and home from university, read a poem he had written about his parents. Carlos, now graying and slower but still loyal, raised a toast to the best friends he had ever known. Mrs. Patterson, elderly but still sharp, told stories about the early days, about the scared young woman who had come to work at her boarding house, and the determined cowboy who had seen her true worth. As the celebration continued into the night, with dancing and music and laughter, Harrison and Eleanor slipped away for a moment of privacy. They walked to the spot where Harrison had first told Eleanor he wanted to court her, by the river where the cottonwoods grew. The water rushed over the rocks with the same eternal rhythm, and the stars blazed overhead in the clear spring sky. "Do you remember that day by the river when I asked to court you?" Harrison asked. "You were so scared, so certain that I would hurt you or leave you." "I was a fool to doubt you," Eleanor said. "You have been nothing but true to your word from the very beginning." "We were both taking a risk. I had no idea if you could love me back, if we would be compatible, if we could build a life together. I just knew that I had to try, that I would regret it forever if I let you slip away without fighting for you. And now look at us. 25 years, 4 children, countless challenges overcome. We did more than survive, Harrison. We thrived. Because of you. You were always the strong one, the brave one. I just built you a chapel. You built everything else." Eleanor shook her head. "We built it together. Every bit of it. Together." They stood in comfortable silence, listening to the river, feeling the cool night breeze on their faces. In the distance, they could hear music and laughter from the party still going on. But here, in this quiet space, it was just the two of them, just as it had been in the beginning. "I want to grow old with you," Harrison said softly. "I want to watch our grandchildren grow up and have children of their own. I want to sit on our porch in the evening and hold your hand and remember all the moments we shared. I want to die knowing that I spent every day of my life loving you with everything I had." "That is all I want too," Eleanor replied, tears shining in her eyes. "That and the knowledge that we made a difference, that our story mattered, that we helped create a world where love is more powerful than prejudice." "I think we did that," Harrison said. "Look at Meadowbrook, at the community we helped build. Look at all the people who found acceptance here, who learned that differences do not matter, that everyone deserves dignity and respect. We started something that will continue long after we are gone." They walked back to the celebration hand in hand, their hearts full, their souls at peace. The party continued for hours more, with stories and toasts and dances, with children running wild and adults reminiscing about years gone by. It was a celebration not just of a marriage, but of everything that marriage had created, a living testament to the power of love to transform lives and build community. As the years continued to pass, Eleanor and Harrison settled into the comfortable rhythms of age. They handed more responsibility for the ranch over to Samuel, though Harrison still spent hours at the corrals, working with the horses he loved. Eleanor continued her healing work, though she trained Hope to take over more of the demanding cases. They spent their evenings on the porch they had dreamed of, watching the sun set over the mountains, holding hands and talking about everything and nothing. Their grandchildren adored them, running to greet Grandma and Grandpa whenever they visited, begging for stories about the old days, about when Washington was still a territory and Spokane was barely more than a frontier town. Eleanor told them about the bullet that had scarred her, about the preacher who had refused to marry them, about the chapel that their grandfather had built with his own 2 hands. The children listened wide-eyed, marveling that their ordinary grandparents had such an extraordinary story. On Eleanor's 65th birthday in 1923, the whole family gathered for a celebration. All 4 children were there with their spouses and children, a rowdy, loving crowd that filled the house to overflowing. Samuel had 4 children now, Grace had 3, Hope had 5, and Daniel had 2, giving Eleanor and Harrison 14 grandchildren in total. The noise was tremendous, the chaos complete, and Eleanor had never been happier. Harrison gave her a locket he had commissioned, with pictures of all their children and grandchildren inside. On the outside, he had engraved, "To my beautiful wife, who showed me what true grace looks like. Forever yours, Harrison." Eleanor cried when she opened it, clutching the locket to her chest, overwhelmed by love for this man who had never stopped seeing her as beautiful, who had spent 41 years proving every day that she was worthy of love and devotion. "You have given me such a good life," she whispered to him later that night when the guests had all gone home and they were alone in their bedroom. "I never dreamed I could be this happy, that I could have so much." "We gave each other a good life," Harrison corrected. "You saved me just as much as I saved you, Eleanor. Before I met you, I was just drifting, working for wages, chasing a dream that seemed impossible. You gave me purpose, gave me a reason to build something lasting. You made me want to be a better man. You were always a good man. I just helped you see it." They made love that night slowly and tenderly, their bodies familiar and comfortable after decades together. They fell asleep in each other's arms, and Eleanor dreamed of the chapel in the meadow, of standing in her wedding dress with flowers in her hair, of Harrison looking at her as if she were the answer to every prayer he had ever prayed. The next decade passed peacefully. They celebrated their 50th anniversary in 1932, another huge gathering with even more grandchildren and now great-grandchildren beginning to appear. The chapel stood as strong as ever, lovingly maintained by the community, still hosting weddings and baptisms and Sunday services. The story of its construction had become legend, a tale told and retold, inspiring couples to believe that love could overcome any obstacle. Harrison's health began to fail in his 76th year. His heart was weak, the doctor said, worn out from a lifetime of hard work and hard living. Eleanor nursed him tenderly, just as she had nursed Carlos all those years ago, bringing him medicine and comfort, sitting beside his bed and reading to him, holding his hand through the long nights. "I am not afraid," Harrison told her one evening as the sun was setting. "I have had a good life, Eleanor, better than I had any right to hope for. I have loved and been loved. I have raised children and seen them grow into good people. I have built things that will last after I am gone. What more could a man ask for?" "I am not ready to let you go," Eleanor said, her voice breaking. "I do not know how to be in this world without you. You are the strongest person I have ever known. You will be fine, my love. You will keep living, keep helping people, keep being the light that you have always been." Harrison squeezed her hand weakly. "Promise me something. Anything. Do not stop living when I die. Do not let grief swallow you. Keep going to the chapel. Keep working with the clinic. Keep spending time with our children and grandchildren. Promise me you will keep being Eleanor, the woman I fell in love with all those years ago." "I promise," Eleanor whispered. "Eleanor," though her heart was breaking, "but it will be so hard without you." "I know. But you are brave, remember? You are the woman who survived a bullet to the face, who stood up to a cruel preacher, who built a life from nothing but determination and love. You can survive this too." Harrison died 2 days later peacefully in his sleep with Eleanor holding his hand. The entire community mourned his passing. The funeral was held at the chapel he had built, and it was packed with people who had known and loved him. Eleanor sat in the front pew, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, and listened to speeches about Harrison's kindness, his integrity, his unwavering devotion to his wife. Samuel spoke about his father's legacy, about the values he had instilled in his children. Grace sang a hymn that Harrison had loved. Hope read a passage from the Bible about love never failing. Daniel gave a eulogy that was eloquent and moving, capturing the essence of who Harrison had been, but it was Eleanor who had the last word. She stood at the altar, this 77-year-old woman with a scarred face and silver hair, and she spoke about the man she had loved for more than half a century. "Harrison Ortega built this chapel because a preacher told me I was not worthy of being married in God's house. He built it because he loved me and because he believed that love should never be denied or diminished by the judgment of others. But this chapel is more than just a building. It is a testament to what is possible when we refuse to accept the limitations others try to place on us. It is proof that one person's love and determination can change the world." She paused, looking around at the faces of people she had known for decades, people whose lives had been touched by her husband's kindness and vision. "Harrison taught me that I was worthy of love, that my scars did not define me, that I had value beyond my appearance. He taught our children to see people's hearts rather than their faces. He taught this community that acceptance and kindness matter more than conformity and judgment. He built this chapel, yes, but more than that, he built a legacy of love that will outlive all of us." Eleanor's voice broke, and tears streamed down her face, but she continued, "I will miss him every day for the rest of my life, but I will not stop living, because that would dishonor everything he taught me. I will keep working, keep loving, keep being a part of this community that we built together. And when I die, I will be buried beside him in the cemetery next to this chapel, and our story will be complete." She sat down, and the chapel was silent except for the sound of people crying. Then Carlos stood and began to sing, his old voice cracking but still strong, a Spanish hymn that Harrison had taught him years ago. One by one, others joined in, their voices blending in harmony, filling the chapel with music and love and remembrance. Harrison was buried in a plot overlooking the meadow, with a headstone that read, "Harrison Ortega, 1856-1933, beloved husband, father, and friend. He built a chapel and a community on the foundation of love." Eleanor kept her promise. She did not let grief consume her, though the loneliness was sometimes overwhelming. She continued her work at the clinic, training Hope and several other young women in healing arts. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, telling them stories about their grandfather, making sure they understood the legacy he had left them. She attended church every Sunday, sitting in the same pew where she had sat with Harrison for 50 years, feeling his presence beside her even though he was gone. The years passed, and Eleanor grew frailer, but her mind stayed sharp and her spirit strong. On the 55th anniversary of her wedding, she walked alone to the chapel, moving slowly with the help of a cane. She stood at the altar where she and Harrison had exchanged vows so long ago, and she spoke aloud to him as if he could hear her. "I miss you, my love. Every single day I miss you. But I have kept my promise. I have kept living, kept being useful, kept loving our family and this community. Our children are all healthy and happy. Our grandchildren are growing up strong. Our great-grandchildren are beginning to have children of their own. The legacy we started together continues to grow and flourish." She paused, looking around at the chapel that still stood strong and beautiful after more than half a century. "This place that you built for me has become so much more than either of us imagined. It has been the site of hundreds of weddings, thousands of services, countless moments of joy and sorrow and community. People still come from far away to see it, to hear our story, to be inspired by what love can accomplish. You built well, my darling. You built something that will last for generations." Eleanor sat in a pew and closed her eyes, remembering. She remembered the day Harrison had first spoken to her, kneeling beside the injured boy. She remembered the way he had looked at her without flinching, without pity, just with straightforward respect. She remembered falling in love, slowly and then all at once, learning to trust that his feelings were real and lasting. She remembered their wedding day, standing in this very chapel, speaking vows that they had kept faithfully for 50 years. She remembered the births of their children, the sleepless nights, and the overwhelming love. She remembered watching Harrison teach Samuel to ride, building doll houses for the twins, reading to Daniel before bed. She remembered decades of ordinary moments that added up to an extraordinary life. Breakfasts at the kitchen table, walks by the river, evenings on the porch, small kindnesses and daily devotions that had woven their lives together into something beautiful and strong. "I am ready now," Eleanor whispered, "ready to come home to you, ready to rest. I have done everything I promised. I have lived fully and well. I have honored your memory and our love. Now I am tired, my darling, and I want to be with you again." She sat in the chapel until the sun set, peaceful and content. Then she walked slowly back to the house where she had raised her children, where Harrison had carried her over the threshold as a bride. She ate a simple dinner, wrote letters to each of her children telling them how much she loved them, and went to bed early. Eleanor Ortega died peacefully in her sleep that night, at the age of 81. She was found in the morning by Hope, who had come to check on her mother as she did every day. Eleanor looked peaceful, almost smiling, and Hope knew without question that her mother had gone to be with her father, that they were together again at last. The funeral was even larger than Harrison's had been. People came from all over Washington and beyond, old friends and new generations who had grown up hearing the story of the scarred woman and the cowboy who had loved her. The chapel was packed, with hundreds more standing outside listening to the service through open windows. All 4 children spoke, sharing memories of their mother, speaking of her strength and kindness and unconquerable spirit. The grandchildren and great-grandchildren participated too, reading poems and scripture, singing hymns that Eleanor had loved. The service was a celebration of a life well lived, a woman who had overcome immense pain and prejudice to create something beautiful and lasting. Eleanor was buried beside Harrison, their matching headstones side by side. Hers read, Eleanor Ortega, 1858-1939, beloved wife, mother, and healer. She taught a community that true beauty comes from the soul. But the story did not end with their deaths. The chapel they had built together continued to stand, maintained lovingly by generation after generation. It was placed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1952, recognized as an important landmark in Washington state history. The story of its construction was taught in schools, written about in books, featured in magazines and newspapers. The community of Meadowbrook continued to grow, always maintaining the values that Eleanor and Harrison had established, welcoming everyone regardless of appearance or background, believing that love and kindness mattered more than conformity or prejudice. The clinic that Eleanor had founded became a full medical center, serving thousands of patients over the decades. The school that they had helped establish became a model for progressive education. Their descendants carried on their legacy generation after generation. Samuel's line produced ranchers and veterinarians, continuing the family's work with horses. Grace's children became musicians and teachers, spreading beauty and knowledge. Hope's descendants became doctors and nurses, healing others just as their grandmother had done. Daniel's family produced writers and scholars, preserving stories and history for future generations. The chapel remained a popular wedding destination, with couples coming from around the world to exchange vows in the building that had been constructed as a testament to love's power to overcome any obstacle. Each couple learned the story of Harrison and Eleanor, were inspired by their refusal to let prejudice and cruelty stop them from building the life they wanted together. On the 100th anniversary of the chapel's construction in 1982, the Ortega family organized a huge celebration. Hundreds of descendants gathered, from babies to great-great-great-grandchildren, all tracing their lineage back to the scarred woman and the cowboy who had built a chapel to wed her right. They renovated the building carefully, preserving its historic character while ensuring it would last another century. They established a museum in the basement, displaying photographs and artifacts from Eleanor and Harrison's life, telling their story for future generations. The celebration included speeches and music and dancing in the meadow, just as there had been on Eleanor and Harrison's wedding day a century before. People shared stories passed down through families, remembering ancestors who had been touched by the Ortega's kindness, whose lives had been changed by their example. They spoke of the legacy of love and acceptance that Harrison and Eleanor had established, of the importance of seeing people's hearts rather than their faces, of believing that everyone deserves dignity and respect. As the sun set on that spring evening, casting golden light across the meadow where Harrison had proposed and where they had celebrated their wedding, the crowd fell silent. The bell in the tower rang out clear and strong, just as it had rung on that April day in 1882 when Harrison and Eleanor had become husband and wife. And in that moment, everyone gathered felt the presence of those two remarkable people, felt the power of the love they had shared, felt grateful for the legacy they had left behind. The chapel still stands today more than a century and a half after it was built, a simple wooden structure in a meadow by a river in Washington state. But it represents something far greater than its physical form. It is proof that one person's love and determination can change the world. It is evidence that kindness is stronger than cruelty, that acceptance is more powerful than prejudice, that what really matters in life is how we treat each other and the legacies we leave behind. The story of the preacher who refused to marry a scarred woman and the cowboy who built a chapel just to wed her right has become legend, told and retold, inspiring people to believe that love can overcome any obstacle, that everyone deserves to be cherished for who they truly are, and that sometimes the most extraordinary things in life come from refusing to accept the limitations others try to place on us. Harrison and Eleanor Ortega built more than a chapel. They built a family, a community, and a legacy that continues to touch lives generations after their deaths. They proved that true beauty comes from the soul, that scars cannot diminish worth, and that love, real love, sees past surfaces to the precious person beneath. Their story endures because it speaks to something fundamental in the human experience, the longing to be seen and valued and loved for who we truly are, and the hope that somewhere, someone will see us that way and refuse to let us go.